Wang Wei, a poem written at the emperor's command to rhyme his composition entitled Enjoying the Spring Scenery while held up by a spring shower en route from the fairyland palace to the pavilion of flourishing fortune by way of the covered passage. The Wei River winds its way through the frontier of Qin. The yellow mountain palace, as in Han times, spreads out along its shore. The emperor's carriage emerges from the willows of 1,000 courtyards. From the covered way he turns to look at the flowers in his gardens. Amid the clouds, the imperial city's twin gate towers. In the rain, the spring trees of 10,000 houses. This imperial progress suits the young breath of the season, and is not merely to take idle pleasure from a world in flower. So we continue with Wang Wei's poems in this section of heptasyllabic regulated verse. So Wang Wei has 4 poems in this section. I believe this is not considered to be the forte of Wang Wei. Most of his poems are written in a freer style. So heptasyllabic poetry, because of its extra length, is generally preferred for, courtly topics, highly descriptive and solemn pieces of poetry. Now, we already mentioned in the previous poem that Wang Wei's reputation rests on his detachment from the world, on his poems describing nature, and as a not necessarily human place, but a place of emptiness and of a illumination, where the human self, like the individual self, does not impose itself on its surroundings, which matches Wang Wei's strongly Buddhist beliefs, especially in his later years. This poem, like the previous one, is a courtly piece, so Wang Wei occupied high courtly positions during many periods of his life, and he would have been expected, as any high courtier would, to be able to produce a poem on a certain topic and on occasion. So in any of the many episodes in the court, in the banqueting scenes, in the meetings, in outings with the emperor, whatever, the emperor or the other courtiers would have expected scholar officials to compose a poem on the spot, or answer another person's poem. And how successfully this would have immediate repercussions for the poet, especially if the maker of the first poem was the emperor, as immediate rewards would have fallen upon the person. In the Tang dynasty, more than in any other period of Chinese history, with the possible exception of perhaps the 6 dynasties, only in the Tang was literary ability, valued practically above all else. And some Tang Confucians weren't happy about this, but we've already talked about this. But anyway, power always valued high literary skill and composition, at the very least for having scholar officials who could draft imperial decrees and give them the shiny lustre of a literary beauty. Okay, going back to this poem, what do we have here? So we have an incident that would have happened, at any time during Emperor Xuanzong's reign. The emperor is moving between palaces. I think we explained in a previous recording that inside the imperial capital, Chang'an, there were at least 3 big palatial complexes. The main one, but already in hardly any important use by the time of Xuanzong, was the Taichi Palace in the north, which had been the first structure built there with the imperial city. Then, already early in the Tang, a new palace was constructed under Taizong and finished under Gaozong in the northeast, which became the Daming Palace. And this was the main palatial complex during all the Tang dynasty. And under Emperor Xuanzong, who lived in a very prosperous age and was for almost all of his reign quite a successful emperor, and who ruled basically the first half of the 8th century, the prosperity of the country is manifested in the construction of at least 2 other big palatial complexes, one in the city, one out of the city. The one in the city would have been the Xingqing Palace on the east, and out of the city, there was, I think, the Huaqing Palace, east of the city, close to some hot springs, which was a place where the emperor spent a lot of time with Yang Wei. So here we have the emperor going from the Daming Palace in the northeast to another of his palaces in early spring. The palace he is moving to is the Xingqing Palace. Now, there is, if you look at maps of Chang'an, there is a big distance, relatively big distance from one palace to the other, but there would have been, joining the different palatial complexes, covered walkways so that the emperor could travel, you could say, incognito and protected from the elements from one palatial complex to the other. And this is exactly the scene that has been happening here, that has inspired first Emperor Xuanzong's poem, which we do not have here, and then Wang Wei's answer, harmonization to the emperor's poem. So the event behind this is a courtly scene. The emperor has gone from one palatial complex to another. While going through the covered walkway, he has stopped because of a spring shower, and he has gazed upon the beautiful spring scenery surrounding his palaces and the walkway that leads from one palace to another. So this would fit into a subgenre of poems, I believe, although we haven't encountered any until this one, I think, in this collection. Is the stopping because of spring subgenre, which is exactly this, like a person is, about his business, his or her business, but the sudden contemplation of spring's beauties stops the person and leads to a poem in which those beauties are described. So there's a strong landscape element here. But of course, this is in, between imperial palaces and in the capital, so the more than a strictly nature description or natural landscape, we have a combination of natural and human. The palaces and the general structures of the glorious imperial capital. At this time, Chang'an was the greatest city in the world, with more than 1 million inhabitants and with marvelous structures, which unfortunately have not been preserved for the most part because they were built of wood. But it was a sight to be seen, and the emperor is describing and appreciating, and Wang Wei vicariously through his own answer, the great monuments, the great landmarks of an imperial capital, plus the extra renewable and cyclical beauties of spring, as Chang'an was surrounded by gardens, and it was a very green city, especially in the areas of the imperial palaces. Okay, so after this general introduction, which has been a bit longer than I expected, let's go to the poem couplet by couplet. We've already explained the title. So the emperor has ordered Wang Wei to compose a poem answering his own poem about enjoying spring scenery when a rain stopped the emperor in a covered passage where he was going from palace to palace. In the title of this translation, the first palace is described as the Fairyland Palace. Fairyland, in the original, this is Penglai. Penglai were the islands of the immortals, which the Chinese believed were in the East China Sea. And during some time in the early Tang Dynasty, the Daming Palace was effectively named Penglai, but not at the time of Xuanzong, I believe. Perhaps this is just a beautification, or the very typical Tang Dynasty technique of referencing a palace by a previous name, or by the name of a palace from a previous dynasty. So traveling from the Fairyland Palace to the Pavilion of Flourishing Fortune. So I believe, I'm not sure again, I think Pavilion of Flourishing Fortune is probably a translation of Xingqing Palace, or it might be just one of the structures located inside the Xingqing Palace. Okay, let's go to the poem couplet by couplet. Couplet 1. The Wei River winds its way through the frontier of Qin. The Yellow Mountain Palace, as in Han times, spreads out along its shore. So the first couplet, we're generally used to the first couplet of a poem to be a locator, to give us some indications of a chronotope for the poem, of its place and its time. And the poem certainly locates us in a place, although the title had already given away that we were at the imperial capital of the Tang Dynasty. We get two images of enclosuring, which do make sense because, both the imperial city and its palaces and its gardens were enclosed spaces for the most part. delimited by walls or by vegetation or by water. So the Wei River winds its way through the frontier of Qin. All the area within the passes Guangchong had been the area of the old warring states kingdom of Qi. And the poem begins with this image, the Wei River winding its way through the frontier of Qin. It isn't exactly a girdle. The river Wei crosses through the middle, we could say, of the front of the state of Qin, of the old state of Qin. So it wouldn't exactly be a frontier, maybe in parts of it. But we have this image of a land enclosed by a winding river, because it forms its frontier, delimiting the heartland, the imperial heartland. And then we get a palace, so a zoom in from Qin, the capital region, to a specific palace. The Yellow Mountain Palace, as in Han times, spreads out along its shore. So the Yellow Mountain Palace, as the translation makes explicit, I don't think the original does, is not a real palace from the Tang Dynasty. It's the name of a palace that was built during the Han Dynasty in this general region. So it's acting as we just mentioned, as an archaicizing reference to the modern emperor's palaces themselves. So maybe to the Daming, to the Xinqing, or to both. But the idea is pretty clear. There is this land of Qin, which is, girdled by the Wei River. And within this land of Qin, there is a beautiful palace that, like the palaces of yore, spreads on the shore of the river. So the imperial palatial complexes. Yeah, although probably here what is really being referenced is the Daming Palace. Second couplet. The emperor's carriage emerges from the willows of 1,000 courtyards. From the covered way, he turns to look at the flowers in his gardens. So the second couplet is pretty narrative. It continues the story. The first couplet located us in Qin and in a palace. The second couplet shows us the emperor on the move. The emperor is out of the palace. His carriage, where he travels, has emerged from the willows of 1,000 courtyards, and he has stopped on a covered way on his way to another palace to stop and look at the flowers in the gardens. So no reference to the rain that stops, or apparently stops, the emperor's progress in his own original poem. It's rather the emperor stops apparently for no explicit reason, but just to enjoy, to look at the flowers in his gardens. The area just outside the capital in the northeast, between the Daming and the Xinqing Palace, I imagine would have been an area that included some ritual altars and also, lots of vegetation, probably enclosed gardens reserved for the imperial person. And the emperor's carriage emerges from the willows of 1,000 courtyards. So it emerges from a space of greenery full of willows, the courtyards of the imperial palace that, as we have seen in previous poems, included willows among its natural decorations. Other translations here have translated this willows of 1,000 courtyards, I think, as a gate, like the emperor's carriage emerges from the green willow gate. So I'm not sure what might be the correct interpretation. Perhaps, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the gates in the eastern part of the Daming or in the southern part of the Daming Palace was called like 1,000 Willow Gate or 1,000 Willow Courtyard Gate, something like that. But anyway, the idea is the emperor has come out from a place of courtyards and greenery on his way to some other place, and he has stopped to appreciate the natural beauty of the flowers in his restricted gardens surrounding his palaces. Third couplet. Amid the clouds, the imperial city's twin gate towers. In the rain, the spring trees of 10,000 houses. So here the view, the gaze of the emperor adopts a more extended attitude, a more extended, the view is enhanced. So not only the flowers that surround the emperor's carriage where he has stopped are seen, other things are seen. This is a parallelistic couplet, so, you've got clouds and rain. Imperial city, I imagine that matches 10,000 houses. Twin gate towers, spring trees. There's a quite rigid parallelism. So what does the emperor's extended gaze see? So looking up amid the clouds, the imperial city's twin gate towers. Now, Chinese classical architecture did include some elevated constructions, and they were highly privileged by the emperors, who played a lot on the traditional metaphor of mountains and towers, the idea that being high extends your view, but also extends your insight. Also, the idea, as in covered walkways, this already present in texts talking about the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, this idea of the emperor traveling incognito and unseen, a panopticon emperor who can see but cannot be seen by his subjects. So the emperor looks out, he sees the imperial city, and references made basically to elevated human-made structures, twin gate towers. I'm not sure what these twin gate towers refer to. I'm not sure if it's specific or generic. It might be pointing to high towers that are built all over the city, or to specific constructions that were built, or in the Xingqing Palace, or in the Daming Palace, or perhaps in one of the gates that leads to the entrance to the imperial capital, or any high structure within the city. But anyway, we get this view that elevating on the vertical axis, you have these big human-made towers from the capital, from Chang'an. So this is a human-made image to contrast with the natural image, to the natural imagery that has been shown until now, and that also appears partially in the second line of the couplet. As opposed or in parallel to these twin gate towers amid the clouds of the imperial city, you have in the rain the spring trees of 10,000 houses. So the rain makes its appearance here. It's raining, and many houses can be seen. The capital was massive, as I said, 1 million people at the very least. So the emperor's gaze looks out, takes a look at the capital, takes a look at the courtyards and gardens within the capital probably, and at the numberless trees, the numberless spring trees that decorate the 10,000 houses, 10,000 being, just a stand-in for numberless. Every person has, or most people have trees in their courtyard. The whole city as such, or imperial power and imperial palaces, have massive towers, but it's the same imagery. You have these vertical, heaven-extending, beautiful objects, whether they be towers or trees, associated with men, associating with the imperial capital, whether it be directly with the emperor or his Buddhist or non-Buddhist constructions, temples, pagodas, and the more humble, trees that are also vertical and elevated and beautiful of the masses, trees that already appeared in the courtyards of the imperial palace as well. Okay, final couplet. This imperial progress suits the young breath of the season, and is not merely to take idle pleasure from a world in flower. Now remember, spring is the ideal season in Chinese poetry. Almost the vast majority of Chinese poems of this period are either about spring or about autumn. And remember, autumn tends to be preferred for the sad, melancholy type of poetry that scholar officials tend to prefer, but this is a celebratory poem, so very obviously spring would be preferred. And in fact, the events that are being described actually do happen in spring. So spring is correlated in Chinese traditional poetry and thought with with directions, with Jing-Jiang theory, with the 5 elements. Spring represents the east, it represents wood, it represents the colors green and blue, it represents the dragon, it represents eternal renewal, rebirth, youth, adolescence, love. So in this wonderful season of the year, probably the most beautiful, the most livable, the most, the most splendorous moment of the whole calendar of the years, because summer's not that good in China, as opposed to our tradition, I imagine. Because summers are stifling hot and humid and pretty rainy in most parts of China. So spring is, this ideal moment. It's the moment of yang strength. So when you take the Jing-Jiang applied to the 5 elements and to the seasons, spring is rising yang, summer is full yang, and then autumn is increasing jin, and winter is full jin. And there's still an in-between season that is invented to equate the number 5 of the 5 directions, which include the center, an interseason period. So this is the time of the young breath, of the time when one should be expansive and appreciating beauty, creative. And the poet says, an imperial progress fits the season. It's an act of imperial active action going through appreciating the beauty of nature, doing something actively. But there is a shadow to this. That of course, remember, scholar officials, including Wang Wei, are Confucians to a higher or lesser degree. And they always have this idea that emperors shouldn't waste time on just pleasure outings, on pleasuring themselves, on frivolous undertakings like music or banqueting or sightseeing. An emperor should be doing his duty and should be very serious about doing his duty. And there is the attempt to, and there's probably in the original historical context and situation, there is an uneasiness among probably some of the courtiers that the emperor is, just enjoying himself in going from one palace to the other, that this is not really an imperial progress that suits the young breath of the season. This is just a pleasure outing of the emperor, which, can always be accused of being rather frivolous and inadequate. The poet seems to try to undo this possibility in the last line. So this is not merely, the emperor doesn't do this merely to take idle pleasure from a world in flower. He does it to connect with the young of the seasons and so on and so forth. But I think, this is just my subjective impression, that this attempt at whitewashing the emperor does more bad than good, actually. Or perhaps is an very oblique, very, very oblique criticism by Wang Wei himself, because mentioning that the emperor is not just enjoying idle pleasure seems to be pointing to the possibility that that is precisely what he is doing, and not curating about the affairs of state. Okay, so overall, not a bad poem. It's not the type of poem we mostly enjoy reading and commenting. It's just a frivolous depiction of sightseeing by the emperor, but so there's no deep feeling of the subjective poetic speaker who is writing on a set topic, and the topic that is being described is not very moving or emotional or aesthetically pleasing one, but it's okay, and it gives us a nice sight at the imperial capital and at the emperor progressing through it.